All right, so this is episode 20 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. This one may be a brief one. We always say that, but this one may be accurate because, like many academics across the nation, we're dealing with transition to all online education, which hopefully will be a smooth transition. Not too worried about it. But I think we're going to talk today about sort of where we are in. I had the outline, the paper outline as sort of a guideline.
Yeah.
And sort of, where we are with the data processing and where we go from here. Did you want to start things off?
Yeah. So I went through about 20 or so of those diagrams that we looked at last time that you could make through. Oh, and now I've already forgotten the name of that program.
LDA Viz?
The LDA Viz, and was sort of using, I was going to take the forms of labor that were identified in the heteromation book that we also talked about, where they have various chapters on cognitive labor, creative labor, emotional labor, and organizational labor. And I was using those as a schema for going through these diagrams, seeing that that theoretically, if at the penny level, the free level, the bottom 20, the middle 60, and the top 20, that the unigrams, bigrams, and trigrams that were showing up some were more in those labor categories as others, right? So we'd at least be able to look at the compensation tiers that we were using for our categories and potentially see that some of those categories contained more labor we could identify as cognitive, some that we could label as creative or emotional and organizational. And if there was a way of seeing that, right, speculating that emotional labor might be labor that's more compensated than cognitive labor.
Now,
what that turned into is
Sorry, just methodologically. So to do this, you were using LDA Viz, and then looking at the categories, or what was the process?
So it was essentially looking at the terms that were showing up to so looking on this, on the right hand column, looking at those words that were, or those unigrams, bigrams, and trigrams that were showing up as very prevalent in those categories, and then seeing, starting to think through categorizing those as, would we describe the, penny or the zero or the top 20 as the terms that were showing up in there as more as different kind of labor types. So emotional, creative, cognitive, and organizational.
I was just curious, kind of how you were doing it as a method. So were you looking at the keenness measures or the TF-IDF measures to get, the prevalent things in the compensation tiers, or?
I guess the key, I think, well, go back to the charts now.
There we go.
So there were the
so this is the LDA Viz.
Yeah.
But then, we also have, let me see, where is that? Like the measurements, let's see, where would that be? Yeah.
Because I was mostly working from the LDA Viz, from those line graphs.
Those like the bar charts.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like we do have those keenness measurements by compensation tier.
Yeah.
So I mean, it probably still functions. I mean, like, so you were finding particular unigrams, bigrams, and trigrams that you could associate with kinds of labor.
Yes.
Yeah, so then maybe what we could do is identify where those terms are manifesting here in the compensation, since these are already classified by compensation tier, we can identify those
Yeah.
terms here and see where they're showing up. There's keenness, excuse me, and then there's also TF-IDF measurements. Yeah. Yeah, I ran both of those just because they're pretty similar, but they're not identical. Keenness, of course,
Okay.
is it's chi-squared, and it's finding basically the difference is that two different kinds of measurements, right? The keenness really is a chi-squared measurement. This is a TF-IDF, term frequency inverse document frequency. You can see they're close. So like for the zeros on TF-IDF, it leads with brand, and then it's got all
Yeah.
the ones that are almost, let me hide this, that are,
Yeah, the ad hoc ones.
that are, oops, I hid the wrong thing. Control Alt Shift H. There we go. Yeah, so you can see there's similarity, like, brand and TDI leads TF-IDF, but is slightly lower down on keenness. And keenness, of course, also gives us raw frequencies, right, of the terms, and then frequencies in everything else, right, as we talked about. So like audit is 172 in the 0 category, and it only appears 19 in the other 4 categories.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. See, I was just to show the up on the screen. I printed out some of those just to help me wrap my head around them. You can see on my screen.
Okay, let me let's see, Control Shift. There it is. Stop share. Okay, there we go. Do you want to share your? Okay, yeah. So
I don't even have my screen. I actually printed them off but I just kind of worked from those lists, right, where it's got where they're prevalent and where they're not.
Oh, okay. So you were using those. You were using those instead of the LDA visualization tool. You were using those keenness diagrams.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me. What did I do with those? I know I've got them. There we go. Doot. Share. Yeah, so like you were using these, right?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. So yeah, these are the keenness measures. It's taking the head and the foot. Yeah. So I mean that's I think probably a good way to go, because these are already classified by compensation tier. So now you were able to take these and then use these unigrams, bigrams, trigrams, and try and sync them up with different kinds of labor in terms of this heteromation framework. Okay.
Yeah, and it got interesting, and this is what I was going to do more of, and then got slowed down as I had to move my writing program entirely online.
Yeah.
And everybody, all the new instructors were had the experience to handle that. I'm not picking on them. It's anyway. Is that what I discovered is, and this is not, it was not surprising after the fact, that to think about those hits, and if you wanted to describe a particular hit in terms of whether it was emotional or cognitive or organizational or creative labor, you had to, and this falls in line with heteromation, is you can't see that most of the human intelligence tasks we're looking at aren't the entirety of the task. Right? There's some piece of that task.
That's a really good point.
And so that's what I started shifting towards, is looking less in terms of whether a particular hit isolated could be seen as either creative, cognitive, emotional, or organizational. You had to see the larger effort it was a part of. So oftentimes, if you look at a lot of these, a lot of them are just going to look like straight cognitive labor.
Mm-hmm.
But they're actually that intelligence task is part of a larger intelligence tasks, so that a lot of the work that people are being asked to do in some of these compensational um, levels
Yeah.
is, it looks like cognitive, but it's actually they're being asked to do organizational labor, right? So that going in and looking at all these receipts and tagging them or reading them isn't really cognitive labor, because they're doing that labor to organize those receipts for some future task.
Now, can you extrapolate like what that task is? I mean, if you're moving beyond the the
Right. That's when it gets more difficult, because
right.
it's trying to see what that, so it may be, so part, I mean, this sort of, not, I don't know why I feel like saying full disclosure, right? It got really hard to part that most of them looked like cognitive labor, in large part because within the heteromation book, their example of cognitive labor is Amazon Turks, right?
Aha.
Amazon's Mechanical Turk service, right? They see it as a form of heteromation that's engaging cognitive labor.
Uh-huh.
And I don't think I mean, I think they're right to see it that way, but very clearly people are doing certain kinds of emotional labor with respect to the Hurricane Harvey,
Yeah.
right? That explicit, but there's also a sense in which some of the tasks that are getting people to engage brands and banner ads, right? There's some affective dimension to those. Right. Otherwise, the risk is not the risk. It may just be that my original scheme of wanting to use these labor categories to understand Mechanical Turks just doesn't work.
That was my
That's
kind of
entirely
follow-up
possible.
is that still then a functional framework if it says, well, all of
Yeah,
these fall under this category?
they kind of all start to look like, and the only way to not do that, and again, but we're in part being somewhat speculative, right? So to a certain extent, if we were doing some other kind of work, we might not use this, but it might be an interesting result that to really think through the labor of what's happening on Mechanical Turks, it's difficult to look at that, to look at those human intelligence tasks in isolation,
Mhm.
because essentially what is happening on Mechanical Turks is a kind of distributed intellectual activity.
Yeah.
And so there might be some parts of what in the long term are creative labor, right? If we want to see branding as something like creative labor, that some aspect of that is being done through a human intelligence task. But then it's hard to understand, but you wouldn't necessarily identify these brands as creative labor as we normally understand it, but they're taking part in creative labor that's being heteromated across.
Now let me ask.
So either, so my, I'm at a sort of crossroads, that either this use of the heteromation schema doesn't work, right? It's just not helpful at this point, and we need to think of potentially our own framework, which is not the end of the world.
Right.
Or it may be that what heteromation has revealed looking at these tasks is that it's necessarily hard to isolate these tasks as discrete, precisely because of how heteromation works, right? That
Yeah.
there's no,
Well, so
that
let me ask
if you
two
want to break
questions.
up, yeah,
So one would be, h- how do you go about extrapolating whether to what degree a hit is participating in a larger labor act? Like when you say, the brand stuff, how
yeah.
do you just assume all brand uses of brand could be participating in creative, or do you have to look at each one individually and parse it out, which we can't do probably?
Yeah. Well, and that was that. I mean, that's the other, as you're getting at, the other problem with that solution is if we now need to start understanding these human intelligence tasks as some part of broad, larger movement, then we're no longer doing
Yeah.
computation, right? Then at that point, we just have to now do straight up human
Yeah.
anthropocentric discourse analysis.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be feasible, but it would change the task because what you then have to do is key upon probably something like particular terms, be they unigram,
Yeah.
bigram, or trigram.
Or we'd have to dig more into the requesters. Like,
Yeah, and there's
like
not a ton of information about each one. But I mean, I was thinking if you keyed on terms, then you'd limit your data by, okay, well, we'll just look at all the occurrences of this term, right? No matter if it's a unigram or a bigram or a trigram, whatever. But let's look at all these. I mean, you can do things like what's called quick keywords in context, where it shows you
mhm.
it's basically like a find, where it'll show you the term with its textual context around its occurrence. And so then,
Yeah,
in theory, if we limited it to, like, let's say the term brand for the sake of demonstration, then we could look at all the uses of that and excuse me, and see, okay, so in context, what's going on with this task. That does change the nature of what we're doing.
yeah,
So it's an option. It change the nature of the task, I think. The other
yeah.
thing I was gonna say is, yeah. So I guess the other alternative would be predicating what we're doing explicitly, or at least one other alternative would be predicating what we're doing explicitly on a complication of this framework, right? Saying that
Yeah.
sort of by definition, this framework would classify all of these as X. But if we dig into the actual
But
material here, it presents a possible range that's not accounted for.
yeah, that it may be that the benefit, that potentially what we end up doing with their schema is that their schema is used to organize different heteromation systems. So that their distinction between cognitive, creative, emotional, and organizational, they're using that to parse essentially particular technologies, right?
Mm-hmm.
The mechanical Turks is a kind of cognitive labor. Wikipedia is a kind of, that's heteromation for organizational, right? And then online design contests are a way of heteromating creative labor.
Uh-huh.
So they're using it to organize, they're using it as a schema for not looking at intelligence tasks. They're looking at it as a schema for systems of heteromation.
Yeah.
Where we want to take their schema potentially, right, of these 4 different kinds of labor and apply them more or less universally to, right, that even within Wikipedia, you're going to see all 4 labor types.
Yeah.
Within Mechanical Turk, you're going to see all 4 labor types. That they're kind of using it as a kind of meta scheme for organizing various products or companies.
Yeah.
And we want to actually use it at a micro level of going into within any heteromation system, you might be able to find all 4 labor types. If that makes right, they're using it to sort of.
Yeah. Although if that's our claim, it would seem like that's a different paper, right? Then it seems like the goal of the paper is to prove exactly that parsing, while functional, may overlook the subdivisions within any particular technology that participate in different forms of intelligence.
Yeah, and we may need to go that road. We just might pick up their schema and use it differently, as opposed to making our use of this schema the thing we want to argue. Which then, right, you said, then that would actually be a paper about heteromation as opposed to a paper about Mechanical Turks,
right,
using a modified version of heteromation to understand it.
Is this a salient enough interpretive framework that it merits challenging, right? I mean, is it something that is big and important enough that it would merit re-examination?
Right.
Like the same way you would with any sort of large predominant explanatory theory, there's always a wave of, well, let's actually look at this.
Yeah. So what you're saying is heteromation a robust and applied enough
Yeah. Are we
framework
punching up or
that it
punching
makes
down
sense
here?
for us to use it? Exactly. Right. I mean, the Hardy and shoot, I forget, because Hardy I was familiar with before, and of course I only have copies of the pages without the authors' names on them. But I mean, they wrote the bulk of the series.
It's in print.
Yeah, it's in print. I don't think they currently have health issues. Yeah, it's Akbia and Nardi write this, and the book I think was MIT or Duke Press. But Nardi's been writing about the internet since the internet.
Yeah.
Several edited collections. I think even going back to the early '90s. So I don't think we're punching down.
Yeah.
Which is both a comment on her established ethos and our lack of one.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess punching at level at best. I mean?
Yeah. There's very few instances in which you and I are intellectually punching down.
That's very true. Even this camera angle is pointing up.
We are losing to our own video.
Well, so what do you think in terms of how we proceed? I got my own ideas, but I mean, how do you think we proceed?
Well, I mean, I think so. I mean, it's going through those keenness diagrams that, under 0, things like audit and classify showed up a lot. Under penny, we get things like search. I need to look more into, there was lots of under the penny I totally missed. I mean, I was focused on the hurricane stuff and and then all of a sudden there's all this election stuff at the penny level.
I know, it's a weird one. That's a weird one that one of the significant terms at that tier is this election stuff. And, I haven't dug into that contextually, just to do a find to see, well, where is that term popping up, And really, I mean, there are a lot of ways to do that, but it's just as easy as going to the, our raw data and just doing Control F and it'll find, just use the stem and it'll find it and trying to figure out what are they talking about with this?
Yeah. And then in the bottom 20, things like extract and readable were fairly prominent. And the middle 60, you get things like questionnaire, experience, impact, survey. And then in the top 20, you get lots of brand and banner, which I think has to do with like banner ads, like responding to those sorts of things. And so just roughly looking at it, that if I had to, a rough and ready distinction is that it looks like at the 0 and penny level, you're getting lots of what we can understand as organizational labor. Right? It's like, organize these receipts. And then that starts to transition into emotional and creative labor. So a cognitive labor, in this case, being things like extract and readable, as opposed to audit. And again, right, rough potentially. You get into the middle 60 and you start to see more, I think, emotional labor that's also partially cognitive, right? Questionnaire, experience, impact, survey. And then in the top 20 with brand and banner, I think we might get something that's now shading over into certain kinds of creative labor. So thinking in terms of, that as we go from less compensation to more compensation, we essentially move through organizational, cognitive, emotional, creative.
Yeah.
With creative being the most compensated.
Yeah. Which makes a kind of sense, that's maybe the most human, as it were, is a creative capacity. I mean, those results aren't counterintuitive, right? I don't think.
No.
Okay, well, so that's interesting because, I mean, my thoughts were it would be useful to, as you are, identify particular terms, or as I've been doing, looking at possible contrasts between terms. I mean, the one I've been dealing with was the difference between the stem of, transcribe or transcription or transcriptions and the stem of summarize and summary, right? So what's the difference between
that
description and summarizing.
That's what I've been kind of thinking about as I go through these various compensation categories that write audit, search, extract, and readable. Because in many ways, I think those are weird. I mean, I think your transcribe versus summarize, I think probably is going to identify potentially a binary or continuum we'll see across several terms, right? So extract versus readable potentially seems like that's analogous to the transcribe summarize distinction.
Well, so what might be great.
What is it? Like extract versus survey potentially runs the same gamut of.
Yeah. Well, so what might be great is you can see my screen, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Is so as we've been zooming from sort of a larger overview into, categorization, and now in terms of data processing, my thinking was that would be my next step, is getting these kinds of either individual terms or pairs. And I was wondering, does it make sense to have pairs and then put them in relief to each other, or do something like, now that we have the compensation tiers, get a couple representative, interesting terms that pop out of each of those tiers, and drill into them. Because what we haven't done here, you'll notice these don't have check marks, is looking at word level. I had it as comparison, but it could be, individual terms, because there are some processes here we can run that will visualize and just provide certain forms of answer about how these terms are different. So for example, an FCM is a frequency co-occurrence matrix, I believe, and you can look at things like take a term and see what it's connected, what it's I don't want to say conceptually, because the machine doesn't know conceptions, but statistically correlated with, right? So I can coerce it into selecting a term, and then it'll show me, okay, well, here's what it's linked to. And it visualizes this, so you can tell, all right, well, so these things are clustered and they're close, and, and then do that with its counterpart. And you can see, what is the plexus around each of these terms. There are also interesting things you can do with bigram and trigram diagrams, where you take a unigram and it will visualize in kind of a radial tree structure. Here's the other words that form bigrams and trigrams with this one stem, right? So survey, and then it'll branch off into something like, cancer, election, you know what I mean? It'll visualize its connection to the bigrams and trigrams that it participates in.
Ooh.
So there's ways that you can, and pairwise correlation also. There are ways you can, once we have terms, be they unigram, bigram, trigram, whatever, once we have terms, they can be drilled into in particular ways, either as pairs or even individually.
I really like, in particular, I mean, whether or not it's common or not, but at least conceptually or creatively, I like the notion of what it participates in, as like you're like looking at some key terms and then seeing what other units that it's participating in, because I wonder if that becomes suggestive.
It might. I mean, I haven't run it yet,
Identifying, right, these are the other kind of terms it participates, that it runs with. And that might be a way of sussing out the contours of these particular kinds of labor.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that gets us squarely into what we're doing, which is, going all the way back to our earlier discussions of that Latour piece on the Hume machine, right? It's just tracing this through associations.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's in fact, I had the tentative title of this piece. Let's see. Invokes tracing. Now, I mean, that's meaningless. That can be changed at any moment. But that's kind of as how I was conceptualizing this. Let me pull up the notes here. Not on my main
Yeah.
machine.
Well, our larger title for this whole thing is following Mechanical Turks. I mean,
Right.
that's yeah.
So I had tracing the human in Amazon Mechanical Turk through rhetorical text mining.
Yeah.
So I mean, maybe a
And I
way.
think then that
Sorry, go ahead.
oh
We got a
no,
lag.
no, go for it.
I was just going to say that, I mean, that might be a way forward, is to stick with the stuff here, right?
Yeah.
If we can, identify those units or terms, or things in what we've already processed, then we can drill into them individually. And then we can potentially
Yeah.
see, in terms of the interpretive framework, what do we do with the heteromation? Does it square with what we're seeing? Would it make sense to challenge it, or to make sense to use or create a different interpretive framework?
Yeah. We may
Because I
just
can't imagine
we may
potentially.
jettison it at that point.
What's that?
We may just jettison it at that point.
Well, I mean, I can imagine it potentially uh, featuring in a later piece, right? I mean, we were talking about using
Mhm.
cultural
Mhm.
techniques in a later theoretical piece. I mean, I wonder, um, would it have maybe salience? Would it give us a means to discuss that in that piece? Or we looked at a
Right.
middle piece where we might be doing, actually posting some hits ourselves, maybe getting some feedback from Turkers. Would it make sense there to talk about their forms of labor? Because we may be able then to, particularly if we like survey Turkers through a hit, we may be
Yeah.
able to learn a little bit more about the broader plexus of the task than just what is in the
Yeah.
language of the hit.
That might be. Yeah. No, I think there's an appeal in that, is that we can potentially use that 4-part schema less to analyze what we have now, and actually use the schema to generate our qualitative approach to this.
The
Right.
questions, yeah.
So that we're not using that 4-part schema of emotional, cognitive, creative, and organizational labor to understand data we already have. We could actually use that schema to help us generate data later on,
Yeah.
right? So that rather than using those terms to understand what a Turker has said, we can actually use those terms to create questionnaires or surveys for Turkers.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that might be a way to go. I mean, yeah. I think I think I think the way forward might be to finish processing the information, and then we can decide from there,
Yeah.
That's part of it also, is
No,
just thinking
and
of this kind of pragmatically. I wanna, I just wanna finish processing this damn data. You know what I mean?
yeah. No,
Um,
it may be what I discovered is that maybe that we don't necessarily need to jettison this. It's that we're using it too early.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's something we can determine after we process the data. Because I mean, that's one thing, is I think we want to be cognizant of the fact that we don't have to dump everything into one paper, right? I mean, this was one project
Yeah,
that has been tentatively parsed into three. We don't have to,
yeah,
we don't have to try and do everything at once. We can kind of move piece by piece. All right, well, here's what the data says. All right, now we can move on from there.
yeah. No, and that, because then essentially what we're doing is, so we use these keenness diagrams, and they have pointed to a particular. I see you smirking.
It's
Um,
it's never going to
that
be
when
comfortable.
they
It's just
so
not.
right, so we go through and notice I've already done, right, some key terms that show up in those keenness diagrams.
Yep.
And then rather than starting to, as I was doing, try to start categorizing those terms, is actually now use some of those terms to now go back into some of these human intelligence tasks,
Yeah.
running some of those terms in context, such as you were describing.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we use right, if we use these to identify salient terms, I think our third move is then to drill into those in context. Not only in their the context, meaning the hit itself and the language around that, but also who are its friends and neighbors. Right, its context understood
Yeah,
as conceptually, who are you partnered with? Right, who are your people?
yeah. And I like that notion of what are these key terms participating in, and I think that helps us under that. I think that will then help us that we figure out what it is they're participating in. I think that starts to give us a handle on the what's meant. Are they participating in something? And is that, oh, I just lost my train of thought, right? But so we say, like, what are they participating in? Well, what I think we'll discover is what that in is.
Okay, yes.
And that will be how we start tracing the human in Mechanical Turks.
Yeah.
That the key terms we're seeing tend to be participating in something that is identifiably human or not.
Or it makes that distinction. It makes the distinction of
Or
what's
that, yes, it's participating in this distinction.
yeah,
Yeah, that may be the better, yeah.
informing. Yeah. So I mean, I guess then so you have just like a list of what you thought were salient terms by compensation category?
Yeah,
Okay. So
yeah,
yeah, I mean, we can start with that. If you want to, share it somewhere here, we can kind of because I had the start of that kind of list. We can just sort of fold those together, and then
yeah,
what you could do maybe is if you can look at them even just through a find in the data, um, and see sort of what's going on with those terms, and I can run some of these things through R, and see which ones provide interesting information.
yeah. Now thinking method wise, does it make sense to have, like, do we want a consistent number of terms within each compensation category? Like, should I
Yeah, I don't
shoot
know
for like
yet.
3 or 4 terms? Yeah,
I don't know yet. I suspect what we can do is at the beginning here, make the net a little bit wider where it's like, this is interesting. And then we'll just check and see, is there anything there? And then ultimately we may cut it down to, as you say, I mean, I was thinking that exact same thing. Is it like, well, do we just take, the top X of each one? But then that's not always useful because sometimes, like in the zero, those top few are all variations of that ad hoc match nonsense.
yeah,
Um, I mean, I think
yeah.
we
For
can,
the bottom 20, the top one, the top bigram is that ISIN code.
yeah, which, is a stock code.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's finding it's for investment. It's finding a particular, it's like a social security number, sort of.
Mm.
It's just a numerical
Well, I don't
identifier.
want to look into that because, yeah, no one right now should be checking their TI Crest account.
Yeah, we'll talk about that off camera. Um, yeah, so I mean, I think right now probably what we can do is just look at like the diagrams and then the deeper data or whatever, and just see, all right, well, what pops out here, and then we can kind of adjust as we
Yeah,
go, because I
yeah,
guarantee you some of the terms we'll find, we'll drill into them individually, and it'll be like, well, there's just not anything here, particularly if we're trying to put them
yeah,
in opposition. It's like, well, I don't know. I mean, they're either nowhere near each other, or they overlap significantly, whatever. I think we can kind of adjust that. I think probably the next step is let's just identify salient terms, drill into them individually, and if we
yeah,
need more, we'll get more. If we need to cut some out, which we probably will, cut them out.
yeah,
Because some of this, I mean, methodologically, you're right. There's kind of the impulse here to be like, well, to be systematic, we should just take those keenness diagrams, take the first three from each, and see what
yeah,
happens. And we can certainly do
yeah. I
that.
don't.
I suspect the results you get they'll be systematic, but they won't be super informative. I mean, we do have to remember that we're rhetoricians, and we are, part of research is knowledge generating, which means, yeah, if you follow the strict, schema of it, what you're going to get back won't tell you that much. But if we as humans select some things, I mean, that's our role in this. Otherwise, this could be completely automated.
Yeah. But I'm also thinking too about how to get something useful out of these keenness diagrams where you see the distinctions, right? That the ones that are the contrast that they produce. So what I wanted to also do is go into the, like the top 20 and the terms that show up for that, and then the terms that are then, I forget how to write. These are the terms that are most inclusive to this. Yeah. And then the terms at the bottom of the keenness diagrams going the other direction are the most exclusive of this.
Yeah. Yeah.
So seeing if there's anything there, right, that it turns out, because it looks like that the opposite of the top 20 isn't the bottom 20, it's the middle 60.
Well, see, and that's because the way that the keenness measurements are set up, they look at each tier in comparison to all the others. Now it's trivial to take like 2 tiers if we wanted to. You could take the bottom and the top, or, the top and the 0, although those are special cases or whatever, and just set them in opposition to each other. When you look at those, when you look at the keenness information, it has the target and the reference. So it's inherently, it deals with 2 things, but you can tell it what those 2 are. You could say the target is bottom 20, the reference is top 20, and then it juxtaposes those, right? So we can actually,
that could potentially be
yes, I mean, if we want to, we can. Yeah, you go.
Yeah, I don't know what's up with my internet today. Apologies, little viewers. And I think that will let us, if we're thinking too about where these, if part of what we're interested in is where cuts are getting made in terms of human, non-human, that it might be useful to see how, because what this top 20, I'm looking at the keenness diagram for the top 20 bigrams and seeing how distinct it is from the middle 60 suggests that there's some break there, that if there's a real clear division between the kind of labor we're seeing at the top 20 level of compensation, that there's not a lot of overlap between that and the middle 60 suggests that there's something significant there.
Now, which one were you looking at?
The top 20 bigram, the bigram top 20 keenness.
Okay.
So if you look then at the things moving out to the left, those are largely things that are in the middle 60.
And you know why that is middle 60 has got to be just the largest chunk, right?
That's true. Well, that's important to know.
Because these are 5 categories, but they're not 5 equal categories, right?
Right.
0 and a penny together, I think, constitute about like a quarter of the data, and then top and bottom 20%, right? So you're right. I mean, in the opposition, in the reference here, it's probably for all of them going to be largely dominated by the largest category, which is middle 60.
No. Yeah. Okay. But I was trying to see too if there's a way, but now it looks like if we could define those 2 things,
we can,
to get a sense of how much or little bleeding there is between these compensation categories.
I mean, if you want, what you can do in your research is, if you want to see 2 particular categories in opposition to each other, just let me know. And it's fairly trivial to run that. I mean, the good news about stuff like keenness is it's not like running a heavy topic model or anything like that. You can basically just spit these out. It's why I love these kinds of measurements. I mean, it's basically just numerical operations on frequencies. So it's just really fast.
Yeah, because my instinct going through some of the key terms is that there's, and I kind of lost it, that the right as you move from zero to penny to bottom, there's lots of some more clearer distinctions, I think. And then when you start moving from bottom 20 to middle 60 to top 20, those, at least as I was looking at the bigrams, trigrams, and unigrams, that it felt like there were that these five categories that we have based on compensation type, you could also, there's potentially three that at least from terms of looking at the key terms, that zero, there's sort of zero, penny, and then the rest starts to get harder to parse using those four, which may not be an issue now because we're going to use those later. But trying to think about where the potential boundaries are between, how hard and fast is the middle 60 from the top 20 in terms of the kinds of work that being asked to do there.
Well, I'll tell you what, just let me know and I can run those.
Okay.
Like which ones you want to see in opposition, and we'll run those.
Is there a special form for that I need to submit to you, fax?
No, I do need it in writing because I won't remember.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, yeah, and that'll be as I start, because that will be. But yeah, I think what I'll start doing though is just look at some terms that are just showing up in those compensation categories, and then just start searching them in the big sheets we have.
And with keenness, it can be any permutation. I mean, you can do whatever you want. So if you wanted to see, one category versus two of them, it's easy. You just make those two the reference, that the target, and it'll do whatever you want. You just essentially have to tell it, this is category A, this is category B. So. Well, so anyway.
Well, that's all I have.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's our next step is to zoom into the word level, or not the word level, the term, I suppose, level of the data. And then that probably just popped up on video. I should point out.
I didn't see it. I don't think so.
Yeah, so we might as well wrap up then, I guess.
Yeah,
you totally derailed my train of thought. So yeah, we can turn to the term level on the data there, and then we can go from there in terms of the interpretive framework.
I think so. No, I think what I learned this week, and then actually learned by not being able to complete it, which is probably useful, is that I think I jumped the gun on going to that interpretive level that I think we need to, and that I think starts moving us away from this original publication. And I think one of the ways of staying focused on this first publication, but also next steps, is to now use these terms, these key terms or important terms for each, and go back into what we have, as opposed to jumping too quickly to some conceptual categories.
Yeah.
I think we need to do some more. We to go back to that Hume machine, we still need to keep with the associative work as opposed to jumping too quickly to the, conceptual.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, so we'll do that, and then I guess we'll meet, hopefully in a fortnight, if everything's all right.
Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah. All right. Well, you got anything else?
No, that was it. So that was, but yeah, I think what the difficulty I was running into is not really difficulty so much as it's something potentially for later. And sort of, I think of this refigured approach of doing some of the key terms in context, I think makes more sense as the next step.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well,
okay.
Yeah. Onward and upward. I will talk to you in a couple weeks.
All right. Another short one coming in an hour.
Yeah. All right. You take care of what you need to take care of.
I appreciate that. All right. Thank you.
Bye.